Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 16, The 20th Century Pattern. The decision to use the bomb against Japan marks one of the critical turning points in the history of our times. We cannot now say that the world would have been better, but we can surely say that it would have been different. We can also say with complete assurance that no one involved in the decision had a complete or adequate picture of the situation. The scientists who were consulted had no information on the status of the war itself, had no idea how close to the end Japan already was, and had no experience to make judgments on this matter. The politicians and military men had no real conception of the nature of the new weapon, or of the drastic revolution it offered to human life. To them, it was simply a bigger bomb, even a much bigger bomb. And, by that fact alone, they welcomed it. Some people, like General Groves, wanted it to be used to justify the $2 billion they had spent. A large group sided with him, because the Democratic leaders in the Congress had authorized these expenditures outside proper congressional procedures, and had cooperated in keeping them from almost all members of both houses by concealing them under misleading appropriation headings. Majority Leader John W. McCormick, later Speaker, once told me, half joking, that if the bomb had not worked, he expected to face penal charges. Some Republicans, notably Congressman Albert J. Ingle of Michigan, had already shown signs of a desire to use congressional investigations and newspaper publicity to raise questions about misuse of public funds. During one War Department discussion of this problem, a skilled engineer, Jack Madigan, said, quote, "If the project succeeds, there won't be any investigation. If it doesn't, they won't investigate anything else." Close quote. Moreover, some Air Force officers were eager to protect the relative position of their service in the post-war demobilization and drastic reduction of financial appropriations by using a successful A-bomb drop as an argument that Japan had been defeated by air power rather than by naval or ground forces. After it was all over, Director of Military Intelligence for the Pacific Theater of War, Alfred McCormick, who was probably in as good position as anyone for judging the situation, felt that the Japanese surrender could have been obtained in a few weeks by blockade alone. The Japanese had no longer enough food in stock, and their fuel reserves were practically exhausted. We had begun a secret process of mining all their harbors, which was steadily isolating them from the rest of the world. If we had brought this operation to its logical conclusion, the destruction of Japan's cities with incendiary and other bombs would have been quite unnecessary. But General Norstad declared at Washington that this blockading action was a cowardly proceeding unworthy of the Air Force. It was therefore discontinued. Even now, it is impossible to make any final and impartial judgment of the merits of this decision. The degree to which it has since been distorted for partisan purposes may be seen from the contradictory charges that the efforts to get a bomb slowed down after the defeat of Germany, and the opposite charge that they speeded up in that period. The former charge aimed at the scientists, especially the refugees at Chicago, who had given America the bomb by providing the original impetus toward it, was that these scientists, led by Salazar, were anti-Nazi, pro-Soviet, and un-American, and worked desperately for the bomb so long as Hitler was a threat, but, on his demise, opposed all further work for fear it would make the United States too strong against the Soviet Union. The opposite charge was that the Manhattan District worked with increasing frenzy after Germany's defeat because General Groves was anti-Soviet. A variant of this last charge is that Groves was a racist and was willing to use the bomb on non-whites like the Japanese, but unwilling to use it against the Germans. It is true that Groves, in his report of April 23, 1945, which was presented to President Truman by Secretary Stimson 2 days later, said that Japan had always been the target. The word "always" here probably goes back only to the date on which it was realized that the bomb would be so heavy that it could not be handled by an American plane in the European theater, and if used there, would have to be dropped from a British Lancaster, while in the Pacific, the B-29 could handle it. It seems clear that no one involved in making the decision in 1945 had any adequate picture of the situation. The original decision to make the bomb had been a correct one based on the fear that Germany would get it first. On this basis, the project might have been stopped as soon as it was clear that Germany was defeated without it. By that time, other forces had come into the situation. Forces too powerful to stop the project. It is equally clear that the defeat of Japan did not require the A-bomb, just as it did not require Russian entry into the war or an American invasion of the Japanese home islands. But, again, other factors involving interests and non-rational considerations were too powerful. However, if the United States had not finished the bomb project or had not used it, it seems most unlikely that the Soviet Union would have made its post-war efforts to get the bomb. There are several reasons for this. 1. The bomb's true significance was even more remote from Soviet political and military leaders than from our own, and would have been too remote to make the effort to get it worthwhile if the bomb had never been demonstrated. 2. Soviet strategy had no interest in strategic bombing, and their final decision to make the bomb, based on our possession of it, involved changes in strategic ideas, and the effort, almost from scratch, to obtain a strategic bombing plane, the Tu-4, able to carry it, and 3. The strain on Soviet economic resources from making the bomb was very large, in view of the Russian war damage. Without the knowledge of the actual bomb, which the Russian leaders obtained from our demonstration of its power, they would almost certainly not have made the effort to get the bomb if we had not used it on Japan. On the other hand, if we had not used the bomb on Japan, we would have been quite incapable of preventing the Soviet ground forces from expanding wherever they were ordered in Eurasia in 1946 and later. We do not know where they might have been ordered because we do not know if the Kremlin is insatiable for conquest, as some experts claim, or is only seeking buffer security zones, as other experts believe. But it is clear that Soviet orders to advance were prevented by American possession of the A-bomb after 1945. It does seem clear that ultimately Soviet forces would have taken all of Germany, much of the Balkans, probably Manchuria, and possibly other fringe areas across Central Asia, including Iran. Such an advance of Soviet power to the Rhine, the Adriatic, and the Aegean would have been totally unacceptable to the United States. But without the atom bomb, we could hardly have stopped it. Moreover, such an advance would have led the communists or communist-dominated coalition governments in Italy and France. If the Soviet forces had advanced to the Persian Gulf across Iran, this might have led to such communist-elected governments in India and much of Africa. From these considerations, it seems likely that American suspension of the atomic project after the defeat of Germany, or failure to use the bomb against Japan, would have led eventually to American possession of the bomb in an otherwise intolerable position of inferiority to Russia, or even to war in order to avoid such a position, but with little hope from war to avoid such inferiority. This would have occurred even if we assume the more optimistic of two assumptions about Russia. One, that they would not themselves proceed to make the bomb, and 2. that they are not themselves insatiably expansionist. On the whole, then, it seems that the stalemate, or mutual nuclear terror without war in which the world now exists, is preferable to what might have occurred if the United States had made the decision either to suspend the atomic project after the defeat of Germany or to refuse to use it on Japan. Any other possible decisions, such as an open demonstration of its power before an international audience, in order to obtain an international organization able to control the new power, would probably have led to one of the two outcomes already described. But it must be clearly recognized that the particular stalemate of nuclear terror in which the world now lives derives directly from the two decisions made in 1945 to continue the project after the defeat of Germany and to use the bomb on Japan. This nuclear stalemate, in turn, leads to pervasive consequences in all aspects of the world in the 20th century. It gives rise to a frenzied race between the two superpowers to outstrip each other in the application of science and rationality to life, beginning with weapons. This effort provides such expensive equipment and requires such skill from the operators of this equipment that it makes obsolete the army of temporarily drafted citizen soldiers of the 19th century and of the armed hordes of World War I and even of World War II, and requires the use of highly trained, professional, mercenary fighting men. The growth of the army of specialists foretold by General de Gaulle in 1934 and foreseen by others destroys one of the three basic foundations of political democracy. These three bases are: 1. That men are relatively equal in factual power. 2. That men have relatively equal access to the information needed to make a government's decisions. And 3. That men have a psychological readiness to accept majority rule in return for those civil rights which will allow any minority to work to build itself up to become a majority. Just as weapons development had destroyed the first of these bases, so secrecy, security considerations, and the growing complexity of the issues have served to undermine the second of these. The third, which was always the weakest of the three, is still in the stage of relative vitality and relative acceptability that it had in the 19th century, but is in much greater danger from the threat of outside forces, notably the changes in the other two bases, plus the greater danger today from external war or from domestic economic breakdown. One great danger in regard to the second of these basic foundations, availability of information necessary for decision-making, is the impact upon it of the expansion of rationalization. While this has led to automatic and mechanical storage and retrieval of information, it has also led to efforts to establish automatic electronic decision-making on the basis of the growing volume and complexity of such information. This renunciation of the basic feature of being human, judgment and decision-making, is very dangerous, and is a renunciation of the very faculty which gave man his success in the evolutionary struggle with other living creatures. If this whole process of human evolution is now to be abandoned in favor of some other unconscious and mechanical method of decision-making, in which the individual's flexibility and awareness are to be subordinated to a rigid group process, then man must yield to those forms of life, such as the social insects, which have already carried this method to a high degree of perfection. This whole process has been made the central focus of a recent novel, Fail-Safe, by Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler. The reduction of men to automatons in a complicated nexus of expansive machines is well shown in that book. To its picture must be added 2 points. 1. It does not require a blown condenser, as in the book, to unleash the full dangers of the situation. It is a situation which is dangerous in itself, even if it functions perfectly. And 2. The avoidance of the ultimate total catastrophe in the book, because a few men at and near the top were able to resume the human functions of decision, self-sacrifice, love of their fellow men, and hope for the future, should not conceal the fact that the whole world in that story came within minutes of handing its resources over to the insects. Regardless of the outcome of the situation, it is increasingly clear that, in the 20th century, the expert will replace the industrial tycoon in control of the economic system, even as he will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This is because planning will inevitably replace laissez-faire in the relationships between the two systems. This planning may not be single or unified, but it will be planning, in which the main framework and operational forces of the system will be established and limited by the experts on the governmental side. Then the experts within the big units on the economic side will do their planning within these established limitations. Hopefully, the elements of choice and freedom may survive for the ordinary individual, in that he may be free to make a choice between two opposing political groups, even if these groups have little policy choice within the parameters of policy established by the experts. And he may have the choice to switch his economic support from one large unit to another. But, in general, his freedom of choice will be controlled within very narrow alternatives, by the fact that he will be numbered from birth and followed, as a number, through his educational training, his required military or other public service, his tax contributions, his health and medical requirements, and his final retirement and death benefits. Eventually, in 2 or 3 generations, as the ordinary individual who is not an expert or a skilled professional soldier or a prominent industrial executive becomes of less personal concern to the government, his contacts with the government will become less direct and will take place increasingly through intermediaries. Some movement in this direction may be seen already in those cases where taxpayers whose incomes are entirely from wages or salaries find that their whole tax is already paid by their employer, or in the decreasing need for the military draftee to be called to serve by a letter from the president. The development of such a situation, a kind of neo-feudalism, in which the relationships of ordinary people to government cease to be direct and are increasingly through intermediaries, who are private rather than public authorities, is a long way in the future. One consequence of the nuclear rivalry has been the almost total destruction of international law and the international community as they existed from the middle of the 17th century to the end of the 19th. That old international law was based on a number of sharp rational distinctions which no longer exist. These include the distinction between war and peace, the rights of neutrals, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, the nature of the state, and the distinction between public and private authority. These are now either destroyed or in great confusion. We have already seen the obliteration of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, between neutrals and belligerents brought on by British actions in World War I. We have already seen the obliteration of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and between neutrals and belligerents brought on by British actions in World War I. These began with the blockade of neutrals, like the Netherlands, and the use of floating mines in navigational waters. The Germans retaliated with acts against Belgian civilians and with indiscriminate submarine warfare. These kinds of actions continued in World War II, with the British night bombing effort aimed at destroying civilian morale by the destruction of workers' housing, Lord Cherwell's favorite tactic, and the American fire raids against Tokyo. It is generally stated in American accounts of the use of the first atom bomb that target planning was based on selection of military targets, and it is not generally known even today that the official orders from cabinet level on this matter specifically said military objectives surrounded by workers' housing. The post-war balance of terror reached its peak of total disregard both of non-combatants and of neutrals in the policies of John Foster Dulles, who combined sanctimonious religion with massive retaliation wherever and whenever we judge fit, to the complete destruction of any non-combatant or neutral status. Most other aspects of traditional international law have also been destroyed. The Cold War has left little to the old distinction between war and peace, in which wars had to be formally declared and formally concluded. Hitler's attacks without warning, the Korean War, which was not a war in international law or in American constitutional law, since it was not declared by Congress, and the fact that no peace treaty has been signed with Germany to end World War II, while we are already engaged in all kinds of undeclared warlike activities against the Soviet Union, have been combined to wipe out many of the distinctions between war and peace, which were so painfully established in the 500 years before Grotius died in 1645. Most of these losses are obvious, but there are others, equally significant, but not yet widely recognized. The growth of international law in the late medieval and Renaissance periods not only sought to make the distinctions we have indicated as a reaction against feudal disorder, it also sought to make a sharp distinction between public and private authority, in order to get rid of the feudal doctrine of dominia, and to set up sharp criteria of public authority involving the new doctrine of sovereignty. One of the chief criteria of such sovereignty was ability to maintain the peace and to enforce both law and order over a definite territory. One of its greatest achievements was the elimination of arbitrary non-sovereign private powers, such as robber barons on land or piracy on the sea. Under this conception, ability to maintain law and order became the chief evidence of sovereignty, and the possession of sovereignty became the sole mark of public authority and the existence of a state. All this has now been destroyed. The Stimson Doctrine of 1931, now carried to its extreme conclusion in the American refusal to recognize Red China, shifted recognition from the objective criterion of ability to maintain order to the subjective criterion of approval of the form of government or liking of a government's domestic behavior. The destruction of international law, like the destruction of international order, has gone much further than this. As long as the chief criterion for a state's sovereignty, and hence of recognition, was ability to maintain order, states in international law were regarded as equal. This concept is still recognized in theory in such organizations as the Assembly of the United Nations. But the achievement of nuclear weapons, by creating two superpowers in a Cold War, destroyed the fact of the equality of states. This had the obvious result of creating powers on two levels, ordinary and super. But it had the less obvious and more significant consequence of permitting the existence of states of lower levels of power, far below the level of ordinary powers. This arose because the nuclear stalemate of the two superpowers created an umbrella of fear of precipitating nuclear war, which falsified their abilities to act at all. As a result, all kinds of groups and individuals could do all kinds of actions to destroy law and order without suffering the consequences of forcible retaliation by ordinary powers or by the superpowers, and could become reorganized as states when they were still totally lacking in the traditional attributes of statehood. For example, the Leopoldsville group were reorganized as the real government of the whole Congo. in spite of the fact that they were incapable of maintaining law and order over the area, or even in Leopoldsville itself. In a similar way, a gang of rebels in Yemen in 1962 were instantly recognized before they gave any evidence whatever of ability to maintain control or of readiness to assume the existing international obligations of the Yemen state, and before it was established that their claims to have killed the king were true. In Togo, in the following year, a band of disgruntled soldiers killed the president, Sylvanus Olympio, and replaced him with a recalled political exile. Under the umbrella of nuclear stalemate, the boundaries of old states are shattered by guerrillas in conflict, supported by outsiders. Outside governments subsidize murders or revolts, as the Russians did in Iraq in July 1958, or as Nasser of Egypt did in Jordan, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere in the whole period after 1953, and as the American CIA did in several places successfully in Iran in August 1953 and in Guatemala in May 1954, or very unsuccessfully as in the Cuban invasion of April 1961. Under the Cold War umbrella, small groups or areas can obtain recognition as states without any need to demonstrate the traditional characteristics of statehood, namely the ability to maintain their frontiers against their neighbors by force and the ability to maintain order within these frontiers. They can do this either by securing the intervention, usually secret, of some outside power, or even by preventing the intervention of a recognized power, fearful of precipitating nuclear or lesser conflict. In this way, areas with a few states, such as Southeast Asia, were shattered into many. States went out of existence or appeared, as Syria did in 1958 and 1961, and so-called new states came into existence by scores without reference to any traditional realities of political power or to the established procedures of international law. The number of separate states registered as members in the United Nations rose steadily from 51 in 1945 to 82 in 1958 to 104 in 1961, and continued to rise. The difference in power between the strongest and the weakest became astronomical, and the whole mechanism of international relations outside the UN organization as well as within it became more and more remote from power considerations or even from reality, and became enmeshed in subjective considerations of symbols, prestige, personal pride, and petty spites. By 1963, single tribes in Africa were looking toward recognition of statehood through membership in the UN, even when they lacked the financial resources to support a delegation at UN headquarters in New York City or in the capitals of any major country, and were, indeed, incapable of controlling police forces to maintain order in their own tribal areas. In this way, the existence of nuclear stalemate within the Cold War carried on the total destruction of traditional international law and the gradual loss of meaning of the established concepts of state and public authority, and opened the door to a feudalization of authority somewhat similar to that which the founders of the modern state system and of international law had sought to overcome in the period from the 12th century to the 17th.